Yeah, I'll start over again. I'm Drew, CEO and founder of Burb. Thanks so much for everybody being here. This presentation really came through my own experience of learning Burb. My background is in product management. I've been in product for probably like 17, 18 years now. Um, and one of the earliest things somebody said to me about community was that community was like a product. That you could think about your community and plan your community and think about development of why people are being there and everything like a product. And it was super transformative for me. It really helped me kind of conceptualize what I was working on. But at the same time, I found, from especially from working with Danielle, meeting with folks like Carrie, Melissa Jones, who are such like heart-driven leaders, and thought leaders in the space of community, that I really started to also see the cracks in the metaphor and where it worked, where it didn't, how you can apply it, how you shouldn't apply it, and that's where the presentation came from. And so yeah, my product background, I was a product manager, most notably at Yammer, where I was employee number 60 up through 450 in the acquisition by Microsoft. Where we grew the overall user base from, I think probably a couple 100,000 when I joined to tens of millions by the time I left. Fawn, which was actually an HR tech platform, largely about employee recognition and rewards for people doing a good job. And then Skedulo, which was, or it still is, a product that helps field service workers and coordinate their efforts. And I think the fascination for me with community was always that like these products always brought people together, and it was fascinating to see how people would use those products. So yeah, today we'll be talking about a few different kinds of community. We'll be talking about brand communities as well as creator communities, and we've got a mix of folks like that in the audience. But largely what we'll be talking about, I'll go through product management 101. I actually do and have run this course before. It's usually a 4-hour long course with homework and exercises. So we'll be doing a very abbreviated version of product 101. Then we're going to talk about, we're going to shift gears a bit and talk about the context of community versus the context of product management and why the two have differences. And then lastly, we're going to run back through all the product management 101 stuff and update it. Say, okay, what applies, what doesn't? And yeah, I want to get really interactive with your own thoughts there. Look at all those nice builds from Canva. Makes slides so pretty. Yeah, so product management 101, it's 3 different sections. First, what is product management? We're going to come up with a human definition. There's a lot of literature out there about what product management is, but we're going to try and arrive at something that we can kind of use as our basis moving forward. 2, we're going to talk through sort of the language of product, and the language of product is often these days the language of the internet. So a lot of these terms will be familiar to you, but we'll get into some pretty technical definitions of exactly what those terms mean. Lastly, kind of the most important job of product management, decision making, and prioritization. We're going to talk about frameworks, capabilities, data, all the things that PMs use to make decisions, and that we can use kind of as a basis then for comparison. So if you're, you Google product management and you're trying to figure out what it is, you get a lot of diagrams like this with product management in the middle. I think any job that you have, if people are producing content about it, they're going to put themselves in the middle. But this is product management definitely does sit in the middle of a lot of different functions. Or you'll see things like this that show kind of like the entirety of everything happening around the existence of a product, where a product is in the middle, kind of the constant middle child of jobs. Functionally, the way I think about it is product management has a very broad remit to deliver and define success for a given product. Ultimately, some people will say you're the CEO of the product. Some people will grumble and say that they are the janitor of a product. The way I tend to think about it is actually like product glue. Anything that's working about a product or not is kind of on the product manager to figure that out. So that encompasses research, understanding what the market is, where the market is going, what users want now, what they're going to want in the future, planning, turning that into a plan for execution, saying, okay, here's what we need to do to get to the place where this product can be successful, where people are going to want it, use it, and buy it. Coordination, which is a huge chunk of the job, which is working cross-functionally. And this is, fundamentally one of the most valuable aspects of product management is that product manager kind of has their head up and is looking around, whereas an engineering or R&D team has their heads down. They're focused on delivering tasks. The product management team are the ones who are looking around and taking kind of a broad view of things out there in the world. And then lastly, operating those iterations. So taking all of that together and then continually iterating with the market, with the field to understand and deliver kind of more and more value based on, kind of all of these prior steps. And so the fundamental product question for me is, how do I care about the right things? How do I understand what the market wants, what it needs? How do I deliver on those things? How do I orient myself and my activities and ultimately the activities of everyone working on the product in the right direction to have the maximum impact? So there's a lot of jargon. A lot of this has, as I mentioned, kind of broadened itself into broader parlance as we've become more and more consumers of digital products. Product managers will use terms like users. A user is pretty much everyone who signs up for a given product, everyone who's using the product, and then customer. Customer is specifically somebody who pays you. So it's almost like a Venn diagram where users is sort of everybody and customers is kind of a smaller circle in there. Engagement. So engagement ultimately is the degree to which users use the product, what they're engaging with, the features that they're engaging with. Product managers, and we'll get into the data in just a minute, but measure tons of different signals of who's using a product, what they're using it for, to understand kind of end user value, what people are getting the most value out of in using your product, what keeps them coming back, what will eventually make the company money relating to that product. Flows and funnels, you might be familiar with this, in a marketing context. Somebody goes from being a lead to being a customer. Those also exist a lot within products. You'll have your sign up flow that'll start with somebody clicking a button on the landing page all the way through signing up for the product. And then you'll have individual flows and funnels within the product. At the end of the day, you want people to engage with various parts of the product, whether it's a purchase, whether it's getting up to using part of the product or a feature that you've built. So product managers think a lot about these various flows through the products, the funnels of delivery of activity, and the usage of the features through those concepts. User experience, UX, I think is one that's pretty common these days outside of the tech world. But UX, kind of defines the process of flows. So how do you get somebody to, you've got this great feature idea, you think everybody's going to love it. How do you get them to the point of engaging with, understanding that your product has that capability and integrating with that? And then ultimately that all culminates in basically defining what user value looks like. Why do people care about your product? What's the mental association that they have with your product? Why are they going to keep using it? Why are they going to give you money? Mental models, one that comes from user experience. I love this concept, both for products as well as communities. Whenever somebody comes to your product, they're coming with a lot of expectations. They know something analogous. Something that we thought about a lot with Yammer was, the mental model a lot of people have of collaboration was actually email. So as much as you, or Facebook in a lot of cases, so as much as you want to go build a novel UX and make the whole thing like, fun to play like a video game, the person's coming with an expectation, and the expectation is links are going to be on the left-hand side, text is going to be in the middle. You're going to have a handful of links across the top. And like, if you try and break too much out of that, out of their mental model, if you try and switch up the UX too much, they're not going to know what to do when they get there. And then the last term we'll talk about here, which I think is super, super applicable to community, and probably what got me most excited about the concept in the first place is discovery. Discovery is the research process by which you understand new products, new feature capabilities. It's the early days when you don't have a lot of data to back up your decision making, where you have to really use your intuition and talk to people about what they want. And of course, a lot of product is based on this concept called Agile, which you might have heard about if you have a lot of tech friends. If not, it might be kind kind of it's a common sense process, but one that doesn't necessarily, isn't necessarily super intuitive at the outset. But Agile was developed basically through lean manufacturing processes. And the idea is, the old model of software development was you give the engineers a set of requirements, they go build it for 6 months, and the end of 6 months, they ship it and like, cool, like it, move on, here's another 6 months of work. The idea was that we weren't appropriately working with our customers in delivery of those things. And thus those long 6 month, in Microsoft's case, it was 3 years development cycles meant that we didn't really know what people wanted. And so we were taking big swings and guesses over time, and that was really inefficient to do that. And so what Agile does is really prioritize iteration with your customers. It says, I'm interested, I think there's a feature that's going to be, really, really impactful for my users. Rather than go build every possible widget and wingding of that feature and just assume that my intuition is really good, I'm going to build what they call a minimum viable product, or an MVP, the smallest possible thing that I can build to test that feature is a good idea. So you can think of a feature as a hypothesis, the MVP as kind of the test case, and then you actually run the experiment. You say, okay, now I've got the old way, I've got the new way. I'm going to show these to my customers, and if they like the new way, then we're gonna go forward with the new way. If they don't like the new way, we're gonna go back to the old way. And this is Agile development, where you do these things in short sort of iterations. So we actually do these in 2-week sprints sometimes, and sometimes it's even less than that. It can be a day to ship and deploy and develop. But the real value here is coordination, closeness with the customer, closeness with the user, and getting a lot of feedback as quickly as possible, so that you build small things, ship small things, get feedback, and keep going. And so Agile development and modern product management is like just baked into the culture at this point. So everyone, you'll hear me say this if you watch the roadmap video. I'm sure I used a few of these terms. It just kind of defines how and why we do what we do. And I think there's a lot of interesting resonance for how we work within our communities. So how do we figure out what to care about and what the next most important thing is? The first tool in the toolbox, and ultimately the most valuable, although the most time consuming, is user research. You can just ask people. The more you can ask the right questions, the better answers you can get. Anything from just a straight up interview, hey, what are you liking? You have to be very careful with your questions. Humans have a natural tendency to want to please. So if you ask somebody, how do you like this thing? They're going to say it's good. But there are a lot of different layers to how you define that question. How do you ask it in the right way such that you don't, just get happy answers from people? A journal study is really interesting if you've got something that's part of somebody's everyday life and you're trying to understand how to make it more so. You can have them actually keep a journal of what and when they're using their product, what their day looks like. You will get a lot of feedback, of course, through sales calls and what people are looking for. I think I had a bit of an epiphany, and Becky was chatted with me right after I had an epiphany this week, talking to a bunch of folks about what they needed out of the product. And you'll get a lot of great input there, and it's usually pretty strong when you get those signals. And then you can test UX. There are all kinds of tools for testing, see how people understand the product that you're building. And then, of course, through case studies, and even case studies of other products, similar to your market. You can also look at historical data. This would be usage data of your own product and things related to your product. And also, conduct market research, whether that's, competitive analysis, looking at things like your product. You can develop personas. Who are the kinds of people that we want to reach? What are they doing? What do they care about? You could run market surveys. I do this a lot. I got 2 different methods for this. There's an app called Pollfish where you can basically specify your audience, give them a bunch of questions, and see how things perform. You could also send out, I also will, I'll test through Facebook ads. Like if I think there's an interesting new thing that we're working on, I think it's really cool, and then people are going to want to check it out. I'll sometimes run a Facebook ad and super low dollar amounts, a few dollars a day, and see if people click it. If that term is valuable, if people want to use that thing, they're gonna click a Facebook ad. And then, yeah, we'll talk about satisfaction surveys in a bit. You can send those out to your existing members, see what they like, see what they're valuing, and continue to iterate kind of along those lines. And then the last piece that we were talking about, somewhat related to the Agile is, a multivariate test. And this is something that is particularly common in technology, and you'll have seen this through Facebook and other apps you use, where they'll run two different versions of the same product, but two different users might get two different views of that product. So whenever Facebook tests like a big thing, like when they move to cards, from their old feed style, they'll test that and run that test usually in like New Zealand for a year or so before you'll ever see it. And their goal is to look at engagement numbers over that time period. Did this drive down engagement? Did it increase the things that we wanted? Did it improve in other areas? And we'll talk about the metrics that they use to evaluate that in a minute. And so we have a blog post about this actually up on the site right now, but we'll talk about the different categories of metrics. So first, I'll talk about core metrics, and core metrics are kind of what we think of as being inviolate, the things that you can't make go down. So any new feature that you want to add, any new capability that you want to add, you first run it against your core metrics. And if it makes any of the core metrics go down, that's not a good feature. That's not a thing that you want to build. And so we'll talk about the categories of these metrics in a minute, but things like new members, that's obvious. How many people are coming in? You look at that on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Active users, in product parlance, active users are just people who show up. And that's a little different, I think, from product. But the idea is that active users, active users are, they can be lurkers. They don't necessarily have to engage with your product. I think that's something that's a little bit debatable in the community world. The idea is if somebody's coming back, you always have the capability of re-engaging them later. Days engaged is number of times that person came back over a given time period. And related to that is retention, which is that same kind of concept for a new user. Did the new user come back 24 hours later? Did they come back a week later? Did they come back a month later? As you can imagine, those things compound and all relate to each other. So a person who comes back in 2 days is a lot more likely to come back in a week, is a lot more likely to come back in a month, is a lot more likely to be a user long term. So the more you can do to boost that overall onboarding, the better it's going to be for usage. Stickiness, this one's kind of tricky to understand, but the idea is you take your active users, measure daily, weekly, monthly, and then divide it by your monthly active users. And this forms your stickiness score. So conceptually here is if, half of your users in a given month, so if your stickiness score is 50%, come back on a daily basis, so that's like Facebook metrics. Those are absurdly high. So it's daily active over monthly active equals of the people who showed up this month, how many came back in a given day. And you'll find that different products have different rhythms here. Something like Burb, which is a SaaS product, probably has a little bit more of a weekly cadence than a daily cadence. Something like an email app or like Slack or communication app, really you want that more daily cadence. And so they want to show and they want to understand how often all of their users of a given month are coming back per day. And then lastly is one that we borrow from marketing, K factor or virality. You'll also have seen calculations of this relating to, unfortunately, the pandemic, that basically says of a person who takes a given action, how many more people do they create that also take that action? So in growth terms, it says if one person signs up, they invite 3 of their friends, or one of those people signs up and they invite 3 of their friends, and one of those people signs up. What you're looking at there is a K factor of, it'll be like 1.3. It's the number of users that sign up as a result of other people signing up. And so anything over 1 is inherently viral. If you have one user who turns into more than one user, then your product is growing exponentially. If one user churns and doesn't invite anyone, then your K factor is below 1 and your app is actually shrinking in size. Yeah, so we'll talk about feature metrics next. So feature metrics are how often is K factor calculated? I tended to calculate things on a monthly basis personally. Some of these apps have data teams that will calculate all of these things like basically by the minute. But it's really valuable to look at them like kind of like week over week. And so you'll see these graphs that show like this week versus this month versus last week versus last month. And if you go into like an office like Facebook, you'll see like data dashboards kind of all around the office that'll show those things. And so I think it's things that I'll look at is like overall K factor of the product, how viral the product is itself, as well as, for promo campaigns, as well as individual features. So Yammer had like 15 different viral kind of capabilities. And so we'd look at each individual capability and say, okay, is this one really viral? Is it really adding up the way we expect it to? How viral is that feature, et cetera, et cetera. And then, individual apps have individual features. Some feature metrics can become core metrics. So just depending, everybody cares about that previous slide and all those metrics within it. Other metrics like these may become core if it seems like they add up to and improve the set of core metrics. So, cases like this might be, Netflix might care about, the number of shows you started. I'm guessing like hours watched or minutes watched is like a core metric for them, but you can think of like a show start as being a metric that they want to know about. Wouldn't necessarily call it core, but it's something that they want to, that they care about and want to make sure it doesn't go down too much. Similarly, search on Amazon, probably getting more prominence these days, especially with Amazon ads being a more critical business for them. But, in previous terms, it might not have mattered as much as, purchases and revenue per user. TikTok follows, TikTok probably cares about follows, but of course, a big part of their, their app is recommendation. So follows aren't as critical to them as like how good is the algorithm at recommending content to you. And of course, it's bizarrely good. And then Canva, probably downloads is what I was thinking about a lot while I was working on this presentation. It's not necessarily core that you download things off of Canva, but it's probably a metric that they want to know about, something that they want to understand. And the last one I'll leave up to you if you want to fill in the chat here. What do you think is a feature metric of Zoom? Not necessarily something that's core to the Zoom experience, but something that they'll want to know about. And while I'm doing that, I'll answer Joselein's question. From the so the question is, these are from the platform perspective versus the user perspective, right? I think the way to think about this is like things that users do on the platform that are valuable, but not necessarily so valuable that like they wouldn't be willing to trade them for other capabilities. And so what do folks think is a feature metric, something that Zoom tracks that isn't necessarily core to the overall Zoom experience, but something that they want to understand? User experience. Chat functionality. I can see chats a lot. Repeats. Number of joined calls. I bet they track a lot of these things. And probably relating to that one, Becky, is probably like calls that people attempted to join and then didn't complete the attempt. That's probably a good way of gauging UX there. And we experience it today. Bounce rate. Exactly. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Then there are like satisfaction metrics. CSAT, is the old school kind of like stoplight chart. How satisfied were you with your support experience kind of thing? CSAT is limited, and I think a lot of it ends up like satisfaction metrics are tricky because a lot of it comes from the wording. But was always considered a low bar to say that you were satisfied with an experience, which is why a lot of people kind of shy away from CSAT these days, and why they're absolutely crushing you with these NPS surveys, which is that if you ever got how would you rate your experience on a scale of, or how likely are you to recommend this on a scale from 0 to 10? I'm sure you've seen 5 billion versions of that over the past year, like everyone else has, and it just keeps blowing up. Um, I think NPS, we'll talk about the value and lack of value in NPS these days, but I think it's definitely overloaded at this point. Thanks, Alex. And so largely how startups prioritize these things are in three buckets, what they call the GEM framework: growth, engagement, and monetization. Growth being that category of new members. So new members coming in, K factor, all of those things tend to flow into growth. Then engagement, getting people into the app, getting them using with various features, getting them coming back on a daily basis falls into engagement. And then last is monetization. How do we eventually make money from their users? I'm sure you've all experienced startup products in the past few years and understand that, like, sometimes apps focus way to the extreme of growth and don't actually build a compelling app. In other cases, they have a really compelling app that they grow really fast, but basically never build a real business model around it. And so you could see kind of like weird perverse incentives when it comes to the GEM framework within startups. And it largely comes from a factor of how they're funded. They're funded by venture capital money, and sometimes that money can lead them to not think about monetization early, can lead them to not necessarily think about engagement. Twitter's growth monetization model apparently is being worked out in the Delaware Court of Chancery. And so the right way to think about this is, as a prioritization framework, is to start thinking about growth for an app that you're already engaging, and always be thinking a little bit about monetization. So I would say it's never like 100% growth, 0% engagement, 0% monetization. But the right way for a startup to think about these things is kind of all of them together, but like maybe 80% growth, or maybe like 50% growth, 40% engagement, 20% monetization in the early days, and then slowly kind of rotate towards monetization over time. So metrics are ultimately somewhat limited. They can tell you, how you're doing based on kind of a narrow set of factors of usage of individual features and capabilities. They can tell you what's happened in the past, and that's ultimately the biggest downfall of metrics, is they can't tell you, kind of the future state. They can tell you only what users have done to date. They can't tell you what users are going to do in the future. And there was a funny process at Yammer where we would try and look at big weird metric drops and associate what was happening with them, assign causal relationships to events that are actually correlated. So one day we had a giant drop in metrics. We sent the team after it, and it was a holiday in Japan that we just didn't know about. And Japan was a big chunk of our user base. So you can look and try and understand what's happened in the past, but you can't necessarily use that to predict the next Japanese holiday. You couldn't necessarily know exactly whether it's on that exact day. Maybe it's the third week of March. It's hard to use just that data to predict the future. It can tell you the outcome of an experiment, like we talked about, those multivariate or A/B tests. If you show two different versions of two different users and one does more of what you want than the other person does, it can tell you that kind of information. And funny enough, it can tell you whether something's not working. Something that every product manager has heard 50 million times is like, your search sucks. Like that's clear. I get I get exactly why search sucks in a lot of apps. And the funny thing is, you can actually tell. You can look at your numbers and say, okay, the question is, did somebody who search use search more, and were they successful in getting the thing that they found? And so if a feature sucks, people are going to stop using it at the end of the day. They're not going to come back and keep using that thing, and ultimately it'll hurt their engagement after they've used that thing. So you can actually start to glean some quality metrics out of your usage. What metrics can't tell you? They can't tell you what to do next. And I think that's a lot of where people get caught up on the idea of product management, where you hear a lot of engineers complaining about product managers, is that they're going to go and want to test 50 shades of blue, and that they're just listening to numbers. At the end of the day, still your intuition drives what you need to do next. You can learn from the data, but it can't tell you where you're going. It can't give you 100% causal relationships between past events. Like, we think that Japanese holiday is why the numbers went down, but it could be, for all we know, something completely different. I can't tell you when to make larger bets. We'll talk about relative minima or relative maxima in a minute. But yeah, it can't tell you whether you've hit that relative maxima, when it's time to like start over. You can get a feeling for it, but it's ultimately your intuition. I was even just on a podcast this morning that was talking about what happens when a community dies. What do you do? And I think you can assume, that it's pretty easy to identify a dead community and realize you need to change strategy. But how do you engage with one that's declining? How do you know when it's time to completely shift your overall strategy around that community? The data can't tell you exactly when to do that. And yeah, that local maxima, this is a graph actually from Facebook about their big redesigns. You'll be marching up this hill on these smaller slopes, and your numbers will actually start to, you'll be making big improvements, but over time you'll notice those improvements won't have as much of an impact over time. What data can't tell you is that you need to get to this better design, and then the hardest thing to do is this trough in the middle. In order to improve drastically, sometimes you actually have to take a hit on the things that you care about. And these are gut calls, these are intuition related calls, and you need to like basically make the decision to iterate and optimize. So things like, let's say you want to move your community platform, there's going to be a hit on overall usage if usage is high on one platform, but you see this kind of bright new future. You have to expect that there's going to be user drop off, that maybe people aren't going to be posting as much initially. Things like that is kind of what you need to be thinking about when you're making these big changes. And so the last kind of a metaphor that I want to leave you with here is, kind of what I call the island economy model. So imagine that you're governor of a small island, and you are trying to boost tourism to your island. And then you think that can really have a great impact on the local economy. So the first thing you're going to do is, maybe come up with a pamphlet, a brochure, online ads to bring people to your island. And so it starts to work pretty well. People are interested. You'll get kind of the early adopters, the adventure travelers who like a change, like something different that nobody else has experienced before, and they start coming to your island. And you want to, but you end up kind of attracting only these adventure travelers, and not really branching out to the broader audience. You think a lot more people would come if they knew that this was a great place to visit. So maybe you set up a photo booth, one of those ones that'll post on social when they're, when people take a photo of it. And these pictures start to proliferate. They show up on Instagram, they show up on Facebook, and more people start coming. They start coming, and they're using, coming to the island, visiting, shopping at the markets, that kind of stuff. And it does inject more money into the economy. The next thing you're going to realize is that these people aren't coming back. They've experienced the island once. They think they know all the attractions. They're telling their friends, but like they're not returning to your island all the time. And so what you want to do is, start to popularize another attraction. Maybe there's there are helicopter rides over a waterfall. And so you want to start to boost this attraction to get more and more people, to get people to come back. But your concern then becomes, well, maybe if they're going and doing that they're not spending money in the shops. And is that, really an effective use of our tourism budget to get people to go visit the waterfall if they're not spending money? So what you do is you start meeting airplanes with different audiences. As a plane lands, you give them one set of brochures about going to the markets, and another one you give the set of brochures about going to visit the helicopter. And if people go take the helicopter ride and go spend money in the market, then everything's gravy. You've delivered as much value to the island. You've got people coming back. You've got some virality going. You've got kind of a solid set of travelers that are visiting, and your economy's going on multiple fronts. And so if you didn't get the metaphor there, it's really the usage, attention, all these things are actually a lot more about econ than they are about stats. It's not so much raw numbers. It's that attention ultimately is like a currency. People only have so much. They can only spend so much attention on a given place, on a given site, in a given community. And that you really need to think of like delivering that attention to the right places that are ultimately the most valuable. Yeah, SimCity, exactly. Yeah, I've got another slide in here that'll be very SimCity in just a minute. And so the product context is ultimately a lot different than the community context. Of course, in a product context, you've got a team. You've got designers, you've got engineers, you've got data folks, marketers, just peers to lean on, people to learn from. Product managers get a lot of agency. They have a lot of latitude to make big decisions. The reason is also, I think with great agency becomes, great blame if things go wrong. So there are upsides and downsides of that. They'll have some budget. It's not the most heavily capitalized team within a startup, but you do get a certain amount of cash to operate your experiments, run these things. And relatedly, a lot of those times go for tools and things to assign and assess, your success. And then lastly, of course, the products are digital. Software products, especially, users don't interact in a lot of SaaS products. You have a lot of tight feedback loops. You can scale these things infinitely through technology. So that's kind of the product context. And so if we compare that to the community context, a lot of community managers, whether you're a solopreneur running your own, kind of creator community or course, or even, you'd be surprised at the number of one person or even part-time community leaders at, large brands. Do they have a team? How can the team handle the workload is always a challenge. Agency, of course, well, solopreneurs have a lot of agency, whereas a brand community manager doesn't always have that same level of agency. They'll have a lot of people checking in on the work that they're doing, asking them to justify their work, etc. I don't think I need to talk too much about budget between community leaders, but I think that is always a challenge. Tools, of course, there aren't a lot of tools built for community leaders, so they're often having to cobble together things built for engineering teams, for marketing teams. And then, ultimately the biggest difference is, humanity. The thing that you're selling is connection as operating a membership community. You're pitching the idea of coming together around a shared set of values, around a shared interest. And the thing that gets people to want to come back is each other. And so as much as you want to be able to iterate on capabilities, features, and things like that within your community, the value, the engagement, the reason that people are going to come back is each other. And so that's not it's not something that fits neatly into an agile development framework. There you go, Joseline. There's my slide for you, my SimCity slide. And of course, products scale through volume, like just get more users in, more users are better users. Keep building that city, keep building that tower. Communities scale through small relationships. If you dump, 5,000 people into a Slack channel, it's, going to be gibberish basically very quickly, unless you can figure out how to bring these people together in smaller groups, give them a relationship, give them a little corner of the place to communicate. And this is, in case you can't tell, where the name Burb comes from, is basically this exact metaphor. So yeah, we're going to go through all the same slides again, but what we're going to do is we're going to pick apart what if product works and what kind of obviously doesn't. So the fundamental product question: how do I care about the right things? What do you think the fundamental community question is? Let's start off there. I came up with a lot of different versions of this, but I realized it was better to toss that out and get more opinions. Do I belong here? I love that. Growth. Yeah, and growth has a lot of different aspects, I think. There's growth of users, but also growth of the individual and transformation over time, connection, education. What should I do here? Yep. Yeah, that's also kind of the role, I think. The fascinating thing about community management is I see it as more of a guiding role. I'm not there to be a performer on the stage, but I'm there to help connect people, continue to encourage them along the path that they're on, but not necessarily tell them exactly here's the one way you can get what you want. Functionally, of course, product management has a broad remit. Community, has a sometimes limited remit depending on, the structure of the community and the amount of attention and agency that they have. But I do think ultimately you're there to deliver success for your members, and that success can come in a lot of different formats. Research, understanding the ecosystem and what members want for coming together. Why am I going to spend time with these other folks? What's going to keep me coming back? What's the shared set of values, rituals, and things that we're going to come together? And then relatedly prioritizing along those same values for impactful things that can continue to enhance, their experience within the community. Coordination is really more working not necessarily cross-functionally because you don't necessarily have that big broad team, but really cross-discipline. How do I understand kind of the different areas of the organization and ways that I can work within my community, advocate for and publicize the events of efforts of members, whether it's holding people up within the community as models that people can pattern match off of, or if you're within a brand community, advocating for the existence of community based on the impact that those individuals have had for your company. And then iterate, really about what brings people together, continue to enhance that, continue to build that. And much as I like, the term product glue as the definition of product management, 100%, you're the glue of the community. And I think the great thing about a really well-constructed community is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you're just there to kind of make sure everything sticks together over time. Language of product. I don't know exactly if there's a great breakdown between users and customers. I try very, very hard not to say users when I talk about community related stuff. They're members. And I think members really has that implicit kind of sticking together kind of concept to it. I don't have a great terminology for member for a paid membership community, whether that's supporter, but I don't like the I don't love the concept of using the word customer for that. If you have great ideas, go ahead and throw those in the chat. Engagement, I think engagement here is ultimately the degree to which folks engage with each other. We'll talk about some of the limitations of that in a minute. And flows and funnels are really about the path through community and the path for that individual. And a lot of communities are about transformation. I come to here because myself and all these other members are trying to get somewhere, and can we get there together? I really like the concept of member experience, how we think about, kind of all the different aspects of our integration or our interactions with our members and how they experience the community, as well as, member values. Those are the values, relationships, the interests they care about, why they keep coming back. Mental models, I think, are 100% applicable. And then, like, if I could make one slide that was just about discovery, I would, because I think discovering why folks come in, what they're interested in, what their values are, what they like about it over time, the more you turn that into a feedback loop for the rest of the community, just the better your community is going to be. Member Ascension. Yeah, I like that, Becky, as a concept for members who are supporting the organization. Agile development. I think first, instead of feature, I would think about kind of rituals or offerings, different aspects and things that people are coming in and doing, whether that's events, meetups, accountability groups. MVP, I'm a firm believer in starting minimally with pretty much any experiment. And also, something that I think is really cool in a community is also talking to people about whether something's an experiment, just being really upfront with the fact that, like, hey, we're trying this out. We're all humans. This might not work, but here's kind of an idea that I had. Jay Klaus, who's doing an event right now at the exact same time, does this really, really well within his community, saying, here's the thing that I'm working on, and he experiments along with you. And ultimately, those experiments, I think it's still absolutely the right mindset to have those experiments, to be willing to toss them away if things aren't working. But of course, the difference between product management and community in this case is just the volume of data, and your ability to those fast feedback loops versus slower, more human processes are going to be different. And so you just have to understand the cadence and assign your value metrics that way. Decision-making tools, user research. Like I said, with discovery, it's 1,000,000% use research, talk to people, make decisions based on conversations. Historical data, market research, those will really be about how users have engaged in the past, things that were popular. Something to think about, particularly this time of year in North America, is events are tricky to get people to show up to. Understand kind of the ebbs and flows of your community, whether people are going to take specific actions. Competitive analysis, I left that one in there. The way I would think about a competitive analysis is in terms of that economic kind of idea of attention. If you're developing a community for marketers, why am I going to go to your community for marketers versus going to all the other communities for marketers? Multivariate A/B testing, it would be great if you could do that. Ultimately, you're just not likely going to have the volume of being able to test these things really scientifically, so you're going to have to really rely on intuition and user research. Thanks, Alessandra. Core metrics. So we'll run through these real quick and see what works for community, what doesn't work for communities. New members, yes, I think it's 1,000,000% important to know how many new members that you have coming in. Know your growth rate and optimize for it. But of course, it's most important to satisfy your existing members and optimize for more. And as we talked about, just dumping a bunch of people into a single community space is not going to be, effective. It has a negative overall impact on the community. Active users, it's controversial in community to think about active users, people who show up and don't necessarily engage, don't post and things like that. Some folks will say that these observers, similar to product, give you the opportunity to continue to engage this person later. In other cases, people will go all the way as, using the more negative term lurker and say that, that person's not really creating community. So yeah, I'd love to hear if you want to put any comments there about what you think about kind of observers. Days engaged, I think it's important to know the usage patterns, engagement patterns of your members. So I think that one's good. Retention, firm believer in understanding what keeps people around, optimizing your onboarding. This is obviously a big part of what Burb does. Stickiness, our DAU over MAU. We're going to be big proponents of rituals and reasons for coming back. Over optimizations, though, of stickiness, particularly in social apps, is where they get blamed for being addictive. So there is, a negative kind of a long tail of that metric. Growth and K factor, it is 100% worth understanding referrals if you've got, a referral program or an affiliate program. But similarly to new members, you got to think about if you're scaling really rapidly, how do you take that community and break it down into small enough chunks that people can engage, that they can form relationships, that they can really identify with the values of your community over time. Look at feature metrics. Yeah, I'd love to hear, for folks running communities right now, what are other aspects of member behavior are valuable for your community? What are, maybe some rituals that you have? I'll keep moving and talking, and then we'll read through those in a minute since we're running low on time now. Satisfaction metrics, CSAT, NPS. CSAT satisfaction, I think, is still a little weak. The NPS score itself, that 1 to 10 score, I do find that score to be a little bit snake oil, but they do have that most interesting question of follow-up, which is why? What was the reason most, or that you gave that answer? And that why is actually super valuable. I'd also suggest looking into, there's something called the Gallup G12, which is actually really about employee engagement, how satisfied you are at work and how engaged you are at work. And I do think it's a really interesting starting point. But you got to customize all of these things to your community and make sure you're asking like more human questions about the value that your communities are receiving. Growth, engagement, monetization. If you just think of the context of community, it's kind of backwards. And the reason, of course, being that you're not venture backed. You don't have millions of dollars to go spend on figuring out whether your community is valuable and building a big community and monetizing it later. So in a lot of cases, I think you should think about, especially for a membership community, the monetization aspect first. Who's paying for this? What do they want to engage with? And then scaling growth. But similarly, it's not 100% monetization, 0% engagement, 0% growth. It's maybe starting with a trial offer of a smaller amount, getting those users in, getting them to engage, and then growing the program over time after that. So Meg in that case. And what metrics can tell us in a community context? They can tell us narrowly, how we're doing. I would say in a community context, you should spend more time and energy on qualitative inputs than data. And ultimately, what you want to do, as well as from what metrics can't tell you, is they can't tell you values alignment. They can't give you a sense of connection or whether engagement is positive, constructive. We're talking about raw engagement, then It's just as likely a person posting could be a troll, and trolls also get a lot of replies and comments and post a lot and get a bunch of reactions. So you have to really understand kind of a deeper level of what those numbers mean, and that comes through less focus on the actual numbers themselves. And then relatedly, we talked about this before, but when to make big changes, when to shift, make big swings in your community. And breeze through those last ones a bit, but yeah, any questions, observations about product that I can help you with? Anything from the chat, Pedro, that's worth running back through?
Actually, not from the chat, but I have a question.
Yep.
More the kind of the trial that you did for prioritization for Burb that we just run. How, like, if you're running that for a community, because I think that this should kind of fits awesome in a community, like how have you done for Burb some communities?
Yeah. So the process there, I think it starts with kind of the community leader's intuition, and I think you should always do an internal version of prioritization before you go ask. But go do your research, look at your numbers, talk to your members, ask them kind of what's most valuable about the things that you're doing, what they would like to see more of, and then go form your kind of initial hypothesis. Here are the things I think I could do that are really, really valuable. And then basically start to bucket those based on any relations that they have to each other. So if you, let's say, are doing Pedro's doing now our coaching series. So if you want to do a coaching series, and then maybe there's educational content that you're producing, maybe there's an aspect, maybe that's education around a given topic. And so then what I'll do is I'll kind of explain all of those. I'll take kind of the top most important of those themes, show those to the members and say, okay, which of these would you find most valuable, and have them rank. Not the whole list, not the full list of every possible thing you could do, but within those themes, within the top things that you think are most valuable, so that they will give you their order, and then use that as kind of another input into your prioritization efforts. As a product leader, you always know that you're the person who's got the kind of the broadest view of everything, and I think that's the same in community management. Some people have very specific views on the things that they want. So you have to also still apply your intuition along with that prioritization. So it's not totally democratic at that point. You still have a broad view of your finances, your capabilities of getting things done. But then use that to prioritize the buckets. And then once you have the buckets prioritized, then go back through and reprioritize the individual items and kind of what you have time and effort for. And the other thing that I always prioritize in a startup product kind of concept is not just priority, but also like effort and like time to market. Because the thing you really want to do is deliver a lot of value to your users and members quickly. And oftentimes at a startup, the faster you can deliver a high value thing to the market, the better. So if something is low effort and really, really valuable, that's low hanging fruit. You should do it basically immediately. Something's high effort and not all that valuable, that just falls right off the list.
That's great. Thanks, Drew.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll stick around for a few more minutes afterwards if anybody has any more questions. I'll leave you with some reading here. We'll send out the recording afterwards, so you don't have to jot all these notes down. But some things that were really, really helpful for me in understanding product, community, and all this stuff early on. And slides. Yeah, we'll try and send slides. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Sorry for the password issues, but thanks for for getting through them and coming in.